printed because first I got started yesterday. He took me so much fancy to that in the last he could complete his paper and post it at least in WhatsApp. So you can have it from WhatsApp group if you want to have copy right now, and we provide it later maybe so
Okay, thanks everybody and welcome to this session. In this session we have two speakers, Dr. Laxminarayan Lenka from Hyderabad Central University, and the second speaker is the second speaker is Ms. Vandana Dhamoria from Government College, Faridabad. Now, first I would invite Dr. Laxminarayan Lenka, Hyderabad University. The title of his paper is Wriggling Out to Limit Contradiction Commenting, and 5 minutes for audience interaction. So, please finish your paper with 20 minutes.
Fine. Actually, I was quite ambitious in formulating or thinking about the content of the paper. And I was thinking that I could really have a comparison between Wittgenstein's limit contradiction with Nagarjuna's limit contradiction. For the second part, actually, I could not work out. First part, I tried to phrase it, and second part, of course, I have certain things in mind, but I could not articulate. So, but I will try to convey you that what exactly I wanted to do. And the paper is very short one, so that is why I will start reading it. There are more ways of killing a cat than drowning it in water. This I took from actually from Austin. There are more ways of silencing than showing of contradictions. Wittgenstein's appreciable stance on silence is often mentioned with the textual evidence of Tractatus Aphorism 7, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. One of the reasons, if not the only reason, for this prescription is that there is a limit to our language as well as to our thoughts. If we go beyond that limit in thinking or speaking, we cannot think or speak meaningfully. It is better to be silent than speaking meaningless. But this very fixation of a limit to language or thought amounts to a kind of contradiction in the sense that the very thinking of the limit of thought is a thought itself. The very saying of what stands on the limit of saying is itself a saying. Can we think of what cannot be thought of? Can we speak of what cannot be spoken of? If we cannot do that, then we cannot think at the same time both what cannot be thought of and what can be thought of. Accordingly, we cannot draw the line between the two, what cannot be thought and what can be thought. So also, we cannot draw a limit of our language. To draw a limit of thought in thinking is a kind of contradiction. So also, it is a kind of contradiction to draw a limit of language through language. Just to remind that I am not saying a contradiction, rather I am saying that a kind of contradiction. Now, Garfield and Graham-Gist have tried to show that contradictions have been embraced by Nagarjuna, and contradictions do make sense in accordance to the logic of Chatuspati. Hence, wriggling out of the contradictions to silence is not required in Nagarjuna's framework, and there is no predicament of limit contradiction in Nagarjuna's framework. However, the idea of taking recourse to silence is not at all reproachable in Buddhism, and accordingly, ineffability of certain truths are upheld. In this paper, we may examine if meaninglessness of private languages inherits the predicament of limit contradiction, and two, if the like Wittgenstein, Nagarjuna of Garfield and Priest does wriggle out limit contradiction and the Wittgensteinian predicament of limit contradiction is the human predicament of entering into silence. There is a limit of the speed with which you can drive your car. There is a limit to the height you can raise your hands, limit to the distance you jump, the amount of food you can eat, water you can drink, the number of hours you can sleep, work, run, talk, sing, pray, sport, limit to the number of languages you can speak, number of apples you can put in a bag, to the number of pieces you can cut an apple within a minute, number of hours you can think or speak in a day, week, month or a year, limit to a year by month, months by days, days by hours and so on. There is no contradiction in stating these limits with respect to different objects, facts, events, activities. Even we have included the activity of speaking and thinking and put limit to them without contradiction. Now imagine that you eat some specially prepared dishes which prevent you from eating anything further. Your act of eating has put a limit to your act of eating. Further, imagine that each subject whosoever can eat something cannot eat when he or she relishes that specially prepared dish. In this situation, I think it makes sense to say that there is a limit to the act of eating by means of eating. Let us live without food instead of becoming dead by eating deadliest poison, if at all the latter is proposed to set the limit of eating by eating. Imagine that when you are driving your car, you entered into a pond of chemicals but came out of the pond without any loss except a permanent irreparable damage to your ability to drive a car. This is a situation in which the act of driving a car gets its limit by driving the car. Imagine that if someone sleeps on certain caused bed, then after she or he wakes up, never gets sleep again. We may make sense of limiting sleep by means of a sleep. Imagine that the speaking of a certain sentence in a certain way of certain language brings about an absolute full stop to one's use of language. We may make sense of limiting speech through speech. Similarly, if thinking of certain thing in a certain manner brings about an absolute breakdown of our thinking process, we make sense of limiting thought through thinking itself. There is no limit contradiction in setting these limits to different activities, including the activity of speaking and thinking by these activities. Then where and how do we find the limit contradiction? If limit contradiction is there at the very act of limiting. It is precisely when one talks about the ineffable and accordingly to wriggle out of it, we must be silent. What Wittgenstein describes at Tractatus Aphorism said. The predicament he encounters is this. On the one hand, if the steps of a ladder is unreliable on the ground that they are meaningless, how does a passage through meaningless sentences makes you to see the world rightly? Okay. Wittgenstein is explicitly asserting that there is inexpressible, though he recognizes the inexpressible to be mystical, and shows itself. Accordingly, although he keeps tautology and contradictions as the limits of saying or expressing something, contradictions are the external limits and tautologies are the internal, and thereby every value outside the world, ethics is transcendental, logic is transcendental, even I must extend step I further say that even mathematics is transcendental because he takes it as a logical method. For Wittgenstein, problems as well as solutions to the problems of life cannot be found in the expressions or sayings within the limits. The implausibility of a private language sets a limit to language by making it public in character. It suggests that we can use language as long as it is public in character, and beyond that, the use is meaningless. A private use of language is meaningless as much as a contradiction is meaningless. It is so in the sense that, analogous to that anything may follow from a contradiction, okay, any action becomes rule following, right rule following, and meaningful if private rule following owing to private use of language becomes meaningful. A private language makes no sense. Language is dead when it becomes private, and of course, as death is not an event in life to experience, a dead language cannot be used to mean anything. In fact, it has no use to express anything. The dead signs become meaningful only after being put into practice to mean something. And for later, Wittgenstein does not accept a model of language in accordance to what meaning, understanding, interpreting as mental processes do give life to the dead signs. The nonsense character of private language can have more indications than the above said contradictory nonsense of a language. That language ought to be public, that somehow becomes private. One such new indication is this. Right? I'm trying to explain the nonsensicality of private language and the indications out that may follow from this nonsense. One such indication is this: Wittgenstein's private language, by refuting private language, does not commit a limit contradiction. Okay, so it does commit a limit contradiction. In making a boundary between public and private languages, he is trying to express what cannot be expressed. If no language can be there as to be understood by the user alone forever, how does Wittgenstein refer to such a language, and more importantly, expect us to make sense of so much discussion on that language? Private language is a nonsense that cannot be meaningfully expressed, and yet a number of pages have been written on that language, be it about its impossibility. Another indication from the nonsense or the meaninglessness of private language is this, that the nonsense is a useful nonsense when it is found to be inherently there in different dimensions of our life, including the religious one. In a religious way of life, the sense of security, wonder, or even the sense of morality does not fit into the meaningfulness of a language, at least not to be a publicly verifiable public business of rule following. The very sense of absolute safety, for example, is an inexpressible experience that has been attempted to be expressed through, say, the sentence, God will save me. We get another example of limit contradiction, of a persistent endeavor of expressing an inexpressible experience. One more shade of nonsense or implausibility or absurdity may be observed in the epistemologically unquestionable beliefs, what Wittgenstein counts as the beliefs with certainty, which remains on the background of every possible knowledge. The propositions with certainty are indeed undoubtable, and thereby there is no need of justification of those propositions, and justification is uncalled for. Justification becomes meaningless with respect to such propositions, which are like rule propositions or grammatical propositions. that becomes the ground of every justifiable belief with respect to what justification makes no sense. So one more set of meaninglessness or absurdity of nonsense can be found in his concept of language game, insofar as it is the rules of language games are constitutive rules in the sense that you fail to play a language game if you violate its constitutive rules. Then I have switched on to say different kinds of private languages and try to suggest that yes, there also you can find this nonsense, and accordingly you can find this limit contradiction. That private languages are created by means of making communication necessarily fair. So, say for example, the subjective experience of oneself is necessarily so subjective that it cannot be communicated to others or shared with others. It is private. When a disciple is trying to learn something from his or her teacher or guru, the sense of inquisitiveness along with the trust on the guru's words cannot be expressed, it is private. The love of the mother towards her children cannot be communicated or made public, it is private. The sense of devotion or absolute surrendering of a devotee through his or her prayer to God is also a case of necessary blocking of communication, or say necessary incompleteness of devotion, an unending process of devotee. In each case of privacy, the associated feelings, emotions or sensations stand as the inexpressibles, which if a subject tries to express, then she or he is bound to fail. Thus the subject cannot meaningfully express those private inexpressibles like love, hatred, anger, pleasure, happiness, pain, headache, trust, faith, devotion, and so on. Thus, to privately mean something is to express something which is inherently inexpressible. It is to commit a kind of limit contradiction. You try to express an inexpressible. Try to set the limit of what can be expressed and then go beyond that limit as the referent of what you need to express.
Thank you, Dr. Lenka, for your very systematic presentation and wonderful time management also. So, one just comment, I was just thinking about it, that, you made a very insightful comment about, I think, Nagarjuna not making limit contradictions and various finding, if I've understood you correctly, phenomena of limit contradictions within Wittgenstein. I would just make one comment with respect to Wittgenstein that, when he said that, crossing the limit is, putting the limit in itself, crossing the limit, or there is a contradiction. What you would say that, when your car gets stopped by a non-navigable space, or when your eating is stopped by your stomachache or some kind of resistance to a food, what Wittgenstein was saying by saying that you cannot meaningfully put a limit without crossing the limit. What he was saying that putting a limit means you're conceiving the limit. There is nothing like an unconceptual, non-conceptual darkness which you stumble against. That doesn't make sense. That is what he was talking about. Anyway, with this comment, I put this paper open to. Oh yeah, sorry. I'm very sorry. There is a comment by Dr. Pathak. Dr. Pathak, can you please within 5 minutes, huh?
Thanks to the chair. Just a couple of minutes ago, I got an opportunity to go through your paper, Dr. Lenka. This paper is really promising. I thoroughly enjoyed this paper, and I think I'm going to read it again, although it's a very short paper. A couple of comments, not questions. One is that on page number 3 you have written that language is dead when it becomes private. So there is a dichotomy that we need to talk about private language and public language. There is another dichotomy where you have written that ethics, logic, metaphysics, mathematics seems to be transcendental. So there is a dichotomy of transcendental and non-transcendental that is, you can say that pertaining to this phenomenal world. Third thing is there, what do you think you can say, do you see a connection between Kantian notion of epistemic certainty as far as the unknowable is concerned, and Wittgensteinian notion of something that is transcendental that cannot be spoken about. You understand this? So only a couple of things should be mentioned if you broaden the scope of your paper and make it more, articulative. Includes some other arguments and let's say some other quotes, bringing some other philosophers to compare what Wittgenstein has said about limit contradiction. I think everybody understands what is limit contradiction. It is something that it's a more classical logic where two propositions cannot be true together, although they can be false. So for example, if I say that everybody in this room is a Wittgensteinian, then I cannot say that some of us are not, right? So the author is trying to say that this limit contradiction sometimes needs to be ignored because that doesn't work. We cannot always talk about limit contradiction. So this is my understanding, though very short. Just thank you so much for this very promising paper. Just make it more sound and good. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Pathak. Now, we invite comments, questions from the audience. Dr. Professor Das.
Happy to hear your paper, Lenka. Yeah, very, very innovative. I have a few, not question, but that seeking observation from outside. That I am referring to the concept of negative existentials. That is, it is said that precisely that in the case of non-existent objects, okay, the question of contradiction simply does not arise. I am referring to Russell. Okay, this is one observation. You please add something, and the other is you passingly remark that contradiction is external limit and tautology is internal limit. Please, in what sense? Okay. This two.
Should we collect all the questions?
Quickly, my question is, the notion of contradiction is a logical notion, and what he is talking about limit, that is physical limit or any other kind of limit, but not the logical kind of limit. So therefore, there is some mismatch.
Professor, he also has a question.
Yes, sure.
Sir, this is not a question, sir. This is only my observation. See, it is true that we have to, I fully agree with Wittgenstein and your statements, your propositions in your essay that in language, if it is private, it is dead. And there is no use of private language because if at all there is a language, the language must be public because it must be intercommunicated. I fully agree with this. I have no objection for that, or I agree with it. But as one of my researcher that I did on this kind of this philosophy of sensations and the sensational language, I want to just say one word. Why this concept of private language emerged? What is the need? Where is the need? And under what circumstances this private language business has emerged? In the history of Western philosophy, in the history of English philosophy, this should be inquired, and one or two statements as remarks would be permitted. See, the philosophers, they made a distinction between objects which are public and sensations which are private. My sensations are private, but objects are public. I know the object is public through my sensations, but the sensations are. For that, they have got number of arguments, like the particle argument and time gap argument, causal argument, so many arguments they have. Moore and Wittgenstein, they are the chief champions of this kind of sensitive philosophy. So that, a number of examples are also saying that a number of girls are playing football and hockey. They will be wearing a blue dress. The dress is blue, but the shades of the dresses, they are different. Just like the shades of the dresses, the blue color, the shades are different. So also now the sensations will differ. They say like that. And in some context, there is also a philosopher who argues in favor of this sensational language. He says, suppose imagine that there is an island where there is a person like Robinson Crusoe. He has nobody with anybody to communicate. But still, he will be having language of himself. He cannot communicate with anybody because he is a resident person in an island. But what kind of language? God, a kind of language. So, this is the way how the private language, the very notion of private language, it has emerged in the history of the linguistic philosophy. Subsequently, it is rejected because from Wittgenstein saying that language must be public. If at all there is a language, it should be public, it should be intercommunicative. Therefore, such there is private language is of no use. Therefore, it should be ruled out. But why I have opened my mouth here is this gathering. I want to tell the circumstances under which the private language has emerged. This is only, sir, this is not question, but one observation. Submission.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Not a question.
Just let me,
Okay, let's
because otherwise I will forget the questions also. Then you can ask. No problem. Yeah. First of all, to Professor Patrick's thing, yeah. The thing is, I need to improve upon this paper in the sense that I have to really include the kind of promise I made that I will talk about Chaturshkoti and all these things. I have not. Okay. So on that, and limit contradiction, you tried to explain is not exactly that one. Actually, what you said is a kind of contradiction. So we are trying to say that yes, this kind of what you said as contradiction, that this kind of contradictions may happen when you in the very instance of setting a limit. Now the examples that I gave initially is the cases where there is no such contradiction, but we are setting limits. Okay. But when you say that I set the limit, say for example in Wittgenstein case, you set the limit as say anything will be meaningful only when it is in between this extension of language, that is between contradiction and tautologies. Then only it is meaningful. Otherwise, he will count it as nonsense or say meaningless, and that is how that becomes also sometimes transcendental, like your ethics and all the statements related to values. Okay. Now, when you set the limit, the point is that when you say this, in saying this also, actually you are setting the limit. Okay. But how do you set the limit? In saying itself. Okay. So you say that it cannot be expressed. Okay. You cannot say it, but you are even expressing it through your saying only. Okay. So that is why we say that it is, you are actually, when you are trying to set the limit, in setting the limit you are contradicting yourself. So that is the sense of saying limit contradiction. Limit contradiction actually, it refers to this contradiction, that a kind of contradiction you really enter into when you try to set the limit. Now, in the initial examples I gave is that, yes, these are the cases where you are setting the limit, but even if you are setting the limit, you are not actually contradicting yourself. So then, which cases of setting the limits are actually making this or forces you to really contradict yourself? Okay.
Yeah, but I think Professor Bhatt's point is very valid because it's a, we must.
I am coming to him. Yeah, I am coming. But before coming to him, Professor Das' observation that about his, and of course about even for your this comparison with transcendentalism of Kant, Professor Pradhan is not here. He is well known for his transcendentalism, and I have my own responses to it.
Dr. Lenka, if you can just finish your answering within 2 minutes.
Yeah, sure. And with respect to Professor Das' query that how this becomes two limits, one is that it is there in Tacitus itself. He calls one as inner limit, the other one is the external limit. Okay. In saying that the tautology is shared by all the propositions, whereas the contradiction is not shared by any proposition. Okay. So, in that sense, it becomes two limits. Okay. In a sense, they do not say anything. Okay. Meaningfully, you don't get any information in that sense. Okay. And Professor Bhatt's question was that there is a mismatch between the two. Actually, I would say that this is not a mismatch between two, rather it is going a kind of philosophy of logic. So it may be included under philosophy of logic, in the sense that whether you were talking about two-valued logic or many-valued logic, the point is that in Nagarjuna's case, he will accept these contradictions. Okay, he will accept A, not A, he will accept A and not A, he will accept neither A nor not A. Okay. So, I mean, these are already there in the, say, framework of Chatuspati. Now, the point is that in the limit contradiction, the point is that whether you accept two-valued logic or you accept, say, four-valued logic. Okay. Now, whenever you are limiting your word or your saying within these two different models, whatever the model of logic you accept, and accordingly the model of world you envisages, or accordingly the model of language you try to develop. Okay. Whatever you do, once you set this limit, okay, that limit has you are setting, then in that very setting of the limit you are actually contradicting yourself. Okay. So in a sense, and that is why even when Nagarjuna say that no, not this, not this, not this, if you talk about, say, it is not E, it is not A, neither this, say, combination of A and not A, or not the fourth one also. So then he is trying to go into this silence. Okay. Similarly, you go in the Tacitus also, you go into silence when you really cross this limit of cross this contradiction. So that is what I try to suggest, that whatever world you accept, in the very limiting of your world is a kind of contradiction. So is there really a way out of it?
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm sorry we cannot take any more questions for this session. Maybe we can carry a discussion outside. I'm sorry because we have another speaker. I ask Ms. Vandana Noria to come and take the dance.